Periodically, I like to give a shout out to the Patreon gang for their continued support. So, thank you for your continued support. There are several of you who haven't claimed your phone call, so make sure you go ahead and do that. And for those who aren't patrons, and you want to shop around, support the show with a few bucks a month, want to talk some things out, visit patreon.com/CNFpod.
I would argue it's the most ultimate power that any human being has is to create and to talk about or create work that then talks about their existence.
Oh, hey, CNFers. Do you feel the burn of the riff? It's the Creative Nonfiction Podcast. Still going. Show where I speak to badass people about telling true stories. I'm Brendan O'Mara. Okay, but listen, I'm not going to riff on the election. I'm nauseated by it, saddened by it, troubled that someone who is so racist, so fascistic, can be so supported. In the days and week plus since the election, it's like everyone needs to rush and have their take, shame each other, and be like, if you don't come out and say something, anything, there's an assumption that you're hiding something. Like maybe you thought you knew somebody and you wonder whether you can trust them any longer. It's safe to say most people who listen to this podcast skew left, as do I. I don't care if you're a Republican or lean more conservative. I do care if you support that shit stain of a human. Not sure how to segue into introducing our lovely and brilliant and generous guest today, but here we are. Taiyon J. Coleman is the author of the essay collection Traveling Without Moving, Essays from a Black Woman Trying to Survive in America. It's published by the University of Minnesota Press. It's described as a stunning lyrical commentary on the constructions of race, gender, and class and the fraught nexus of a black woman's personal experience and cultural history. Great chat about the writing and courage and oppression and wrestling with the negative self-talk. We spoke way back in August, so I'm at last getting through some of my backlog of recordings. I have one from June. Yeah. So I'm happy to share this one with Taiyon. As you know, show notes to this and more at BrendanO'Mara.com. Hey. There you can sign up for my long-running Rage Against the Algorithm newsletter, or don't. I've been in the newsletter space for a dozen years or so, and so many people have come out of the woodworks with theirs of late, demanding more of your attention, your money even. Newsletters used to be more sacred, in my opinion, but it's like my inbox is starting to turn into this kind of social media feed, albeit not algorithmically jerked around. But some people are using their newsletters almost as a way to get up in my inbox seemingly every day, and it's not part of the contract I signed up for. And if that's the case, I'm gone, friend. Parting shot about reviewing copy edits of The Frontrunner. Also, how this idea of the body being one piece applies to writing. It'll make sense. Trust me. Oh, yes. Okay, so Taiyon is a writer, scholar, educator. She's got 4 degrees, including a PhD in English literature and culture. Her research focuses include U.S., American, and African American and African diaspora literatures and cultures, film, gender and women's studies, college composition and rhetoric, and DEI consulting. She's an amazing and generous person and an amazing and generous thinker. And I'm happy to share this conversation right now. Riff.
I'm going to keep it real, and I write a little bit about this. Growing up on the south side of Chicago, one of 5 kids raised by a single mom, the first person in my family to finish college. Yeah, I thought that's what I wanted. I thought I wanted to go for the gold and glitter. And let me be clear, I'm not knocking that, to each his own, right? Everybody gets to choose. But I also realized that I chose based upon what was important to me. And I do think we get to choose. And I think for those of us who choose this, we understand the importance of what literature does, right? The sense that we leave something behind. And I just think of all the times, and I'm sure you had this experience where you've read something and it moved you, it shifted you, it changed your life, right? And it made like living in that moment worth it. And I think at the end of the day, when all the things are tallied, I think that what we do is the most important because it documents humanity. It documents that we were here, good or bad, and we leave something behind for those people who come after us. So, I mean, you're speaking to the choir here. I think this is the most important thing.
Right, and it what you kind of what you said echoes this wonderful Zora Neale Hurston quote that you have in the acknowledgments of your book, where she says, you know, if you are silent about your pain, they'll kill you and say you enjoyed it. And it's such a brilliant quote, and I think it speaks to kind of a north star of this collection you've written, but also I think maybe a north star to how you approach your teaching and your work at hand. And correct me if I'm wrong, but I think that you kind of echoed that just a moment ago.
Yeah, but I'm not smart enough to say that I knew that's what was happening when I was in it. I mean, I can remember, I mean, I think you're spot on with Zora Neale Hurston, right? I can remember the first time I read Their Eyes Are Watching God. And of course, you know, well trained kid, two generations removed from Mississippi. By that time, all of my language had completely been eradicated from me, right? I knew not to use it. Shame to say I could read her and I didn't understand what was being said. I can remember going back and forth with my instructor between the prose and the dialogue, right? Because in her dialogue, she's using dialect, right? She's using the language that's specific to the geography and the place and the people, and I couldn't even
Mm.
recognize it. Then you can imagine 20 years later, and you're reading Alice Walker in Search of Our Mother's Gardens, and she talks about Zora Neale Hurston. She talks about seeing her at the end of her life, right? And what dignity and grace that what she was found cleaning motel rooms. And when someone was asked, "What are you doing?" She's like, "I'm doing research." And imagine if Zora Neale Hurston would have been someone who valued just the glitter and gold, right? And not that she wasn't a character, right? Because she was just extremely
Yeah.
fabulous. But imagine if she wouldn't have stayed true to the word and to writing and to leaving that record, right? Telling her story, I wouldn't be here. Alice Walker wouldn't be here. So many of us wouldn't be here. So yeah, I think she's important. And I want to be clear, I could never compare myself to someone like Zerna Hurston or Alice Walker. But my God, if they were not here, there's no way I would have been able to write my book, right? Their words are like light in a dark cave.
Oh, for sure. That's beautifully put. And what I love too about hearing you echo, you know, Hurston and Walker, and even in the book itself here, you know, Toni Morrison, like there's a lineage of writers that you draw inspiration from and kind of paved the way for you to see what was possible with words and reading and writing. And I'd love for you to just kind of pull on those threads of the mentors that you've chosen through their work.
Yeah, no, I think you're right. And for me, you know, definitely it was intentional, but also some of it was trying to find a way to survive because I think sometimes the world tells you that your voice is not important, that you shouldn't contribute, right? And I'm so honored, kind of like a drop of water in a bucket, that in some way I get to leave something behind. But also as the teacher, I also feel like it's my job to encourage other people too, that your story is just as important and you too need to write what your story and leave your story behind. I think of Jones Royster, who I started reading early in my graduate career, and she wrote a lot about the teaching of writing and language acquisition and how as a teacher teaching students, it can be very violent if you don't hear your own voice,
Mm.
right? Not only what's being put in front of you as examples of what good writing might be, right? The pedagogy, how you might instruct somebody to write, but then, of course, not allowing people to use their own voices and to express their stories in the way that they need to. Because as you know, if you change the voice, if you change the dialect, you change the words, it changes the meaning. And I would have to say that Jones Royster was probably one of the first people that really made me think about what does that mean? And in some ways, she better helped me enjoy Hurston and Alice Walker and other writers that I enjoy. So yes, I do think there's a thread, and in some way, my hope to contribute. Right? It really is. It's humbling, and so I appreciate the conversation with you because yeah, I've published a few things in anthologies for which I'm very grateful and still feel extremely honored to have had those wonderful opportunities. But this is my first book where it's just what me. And there was a lot of fear associated with that, right? This notion of not only do you get to tell your stories, but you're also speaking and putting your nonfiction narrative out there for the world to see. And in many ways, it's very empowering, but also there's a lot of apprehension
Sure.
around it too. And so, not only do the writers that I adore model a way, right, a light in the darkness, but they also, I think, demonstrate this grace and courage to be confident and resilient in their own stories, because I can think of nothing more violent in our human experience than to tell another human being that they can't be who they are and they can't express who they are.
Yeah, and to your point of that fear and anxiety of really taking the stage with your own book and having your name right on the cover, and it's 180 pages of your voice
Yeah.
and your
Your business all out the street. That's how we
yeah,
used to
yeah,
say.
yeah, and it's your assertions, and it's a lot of people listening to this show, published writers or aspiring to be published writers, and you really feel like, oh, that's what I so desperately want. I so desperately want that, and people should be chasing that if that's what they want. But then when you get it, you do have to reckon with having to stand behind the work and have it be out there to be judged and criticized. And
Mhm.
so and you spoke about that just a moment ago, that fear and anxiety. So maybe like kind of take us to that moment too of when being able to fully be on stage here, and embodying those words, and then it's like, oh wow, this is kind of terrifying being out here.
It is, and you're gonna make me cry because I do think the universe is in sync, right? I don't believe in coincidences, right? I think everything happens for a reason. I would have to say first, as a scholar of literature and a teacher of literature, right? There's this old saying that the literature doesn't belong to the writer; it belongs to the reader,
Mm.
right? The meaning resides in the reader. And so I think a long time of like holding firm that, we're not going to change questions of facts in a text, but interpretations can be what infinite. So I'm a big believer, what you see in the text, as long as it has meaning to you, that is just fine. So I had to let go of, yeah, I could be in my ego, right, and in my feelings, right, as my students used to say, I could be all up in my feelings and think, oh, I think this is what this is supposed to be about. But I really have to humble myself, and through years of practice, I have to understand that what I when I put it out there, it doesn't belong to me, right? It belongs to whoever reads it. And then my hope, the only prayer that I have, is that it has some utility for the reader. And I have to let that go. And like we were talking about earlier, right? We're going to loop back. I think those of us who are artists, who are creators, who are communicators in whatever medium that we use, if that energy is flowing through us, if we're true to that art form, that thing that's bigger than ourselves that we connect to when we do this work, we have to trust that our work will have meaning no matter what. And in no way do we get to control what that meaning is. And in some way, as the artist, then we're quite small, right? What is quite large is what the ability for that work to move on. I think of living just enough for the city. And I write about my challenging experiences in graduate school. And that was really hard because I had a lot of shame around that. And when that essay first appeared in The Good Time for the Truth, my really good friend Taiyon J, she edited that work. She also has blurbed this book, and very appreciative of her, just tremendous respect for her and the artist that she is. But we had a personal relationship, and she knew what the book was going to be about. She had envisioned this book, and she was like, Ty, I want you to write this essay because it's going to be important. And I was like, no, I'm not writing the essay. And we went back and forth over it. And of course, in true spirit, for the powerhouse that she is, not only did she get a book contract, we had to shut up talking, right? She's like, now, put up, shut up, let's do the work. And we went back and forth, and she's like, it's not it, it's not it. And then finally I wrote it, and I was sobbing at the computer. It was horrible in the middle of the night. And she's like, yeah, Ty, this is it. Okay. And once it was done, we went on down the road, right? And it's published. Tremendous reception for that book. I'm very honored to be among those wonderful writers included in that book. And it never ceases to amaze me how many people comment on that essay, not just about me being a Black woman, right? But how it might have affected them in other ways that I hadn't even imagined, right? My job was simply what? To try to tell the story and be as true to the story as I could be. And literally just this week, I had a person email me and congratulate me on this book, but said that they had read this essay and they went to a similar school and that their experience was
Mm.
worse. And that just moved me so much. But then I was so honored, right, that I wrote that essay and I spoke up. So then maybe it makes it easier for that person to speak. And when I responded to that person, I was able to say, whatever you do, don't stop writing.
Mm.
Don't stop writing. Right. And so I think when we think about not telling our stories, that's what I try to motivate my students to say, and I motivate myself to say or to write or to do. I always say, if you don't tell your story, if you don't write what it is you're afraid to write, there's someone who's going to need that story that's not going to get it, and the only person they're going to hear it from is you, right?
Mm.
And we don't get to control what that is. What that is, our job is just to show up in the moment and do the best and be the best that we can do. So that's what I would say. And with that, I would say, is it still easy? No, but I think nothing worth doing, right? Um, that's the hard work of doing the work that we do, but the reward is infinite, and I think it's immeasurable what the reward is, if that makes sense. I hope that was kind of lucid,
Oh,
kind of seeing all those connections there.
oh, for sure. Like what I gather from what you're saying is, as writers as a whole, sometimes it can be we can really be in our own heads to our own detriment. But what you're saying too is writing as an act of service too, which I think
Hmm.
gets us out of our heads. And it seems to me that when when you're being a contributor, and as you say, like having a utility for the reader, you're really thinking about the end user, how that's gonna fall, and it could fall right away on them and inspire them, or maybe like 5 years from now, someone's gonna pick up that essay and it's gonna be there for someone who might need it.
Absolutely. And I think we have to get out of ourselves, you're right. And our job is just to do the work and let go of then how that work will impact others. Just trust that it will. We don't get to determine how, and we might not even get to see how. Our job is just to do it. And that I know for sure. And that's moving to me. I know it's moving to you. I know it's moving to anybody who does this work. And I just have to assume that for those of us, who are in this this place, we've already drank the Kool-Aid. So this is who we are. We can't change it. I mean, this is, at least for this lifetime, this is who we decided that we would be. And for me, I find that tremendously rewarding. And it also, I think, keeps the work going on because we're just one small person. We're like a grain of sand on the beach, right?
Hmm.
I'm just one person, but we need to have more stories, different stories, newer stories. The stories always have to be coming. And, I admit to being a nerd. I don't think it's a coincidence, right, that the oldest form of writing is verse, and the oldest form of writing is what? Storytelling or communication.
Mm.
And there's something central, I think, to our humanity and our ability to tell stories. I think if we stop telling stories, I think we cease to exist.
Oh, for sure. And if we stop telling stories, those certain other powers might come in and fill that vacuum, and
Hmm.
propaganda, you name it. So it's an
And
act.
then trying to tell you what your story is, as if they know better than you,
Right.
right?
Exactly. Yeah. And it's like, yes, if you don't take up the mic, someone else will take it. And it's not a zero sum game. There are infinite microphones, but there are people out there who just have that scarcity mindset that there is only one or two microphones and we're going to hold on to those. But it's like, no, 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 no. We just make more microphones, build more stages, and we're going to enrich the community.
Or you also give the microphone away, right? Like sometimes you exit the stage and give it to someone else. And I also think that's important too.
For
It's
sure.
not always important for you to be in the front, to be the one with the mic, right? It's giving it to other people, pushing other people out there too. And yeah, I'm like you. It's enough room for everyone. There's no single story, right? We know that. And as other great people have said. And in some ways, again, nerd, literature major, I took great joy, like, for example, in reading Flannery O'Connor. And again, people could say she was problematic, but reading her work and saying, oh, I recognize that. Oh, that's interesting. Do you know what I mean? It's not that simple, right? It's much more complicated. And to when discover that literature could do that or literature could have that impact, I could read Othello, although I wasn't around during that time, but I could see myself, or I could understand the dynamics of that play based upon how I grew up as a black girl in the South Side of Chicago in the 70s and 80s. I was like, man, this literature thing is powerful, right? And you just want everybody to participate, because I think the more we make complex our humanity, the more we resist binaries, right?
Yeah,
Um,
yeah.
and the more we're able to really, I think, engage with each other with compassion, empathy, that allow us to heal, but at least I hope community. And, and at the risk of sounding like a hypocrite, even in myself, if I can't embody it in my own self, at least in the art and the work, I can leave something behind as an attempt to do it, right? Because we're all imperfect vehicles. And in some ways, it is the literature, right, that I trust the most. It is the story that I trust sometimes more than the storyteller,
Mm.
which is why I love Edgar Allan Poe so much and the Cask of Amontillado.
Oh, it's such a great story. I love that you cited that as 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 an epigraph for one of your essays. 'Cause that's such a chilling story.
Isn't it? But it makes so much sense, and in some ways, it's telling the truth about, in some ways, the boundaries, or that there are no boundaries in human behavior, and that those things can occupy multiple spaces, and that these contradictions, and that people can do horrible things to people, right? Like reading Faulkner or reading Hemingway, and you go, oh yeah, like I trust you because you've told the truth. Doesn't mean that you fixed it, no, but at least you're willing to admit that this thing exists, right? And as a black girl growing up on the South Side of Chicago in poverty, sometimes people try to say that you didn't experience what you experienced. And to read writers like that put it out there, like Octavia Butler, right, and Kendrick, it made me, it comforted me. And not that they offered a solution, but they were at least willing in the literature to tell the truth.
Mm. I love early in the book where you write, yeah, I still get excited when I encounter empty writing paper today. And
Mm.
so many people are intimidated by a blank page, and it can be paralyzing. But I wonder for you, the how you see the bounty in it, and how excited you get for it.
Yeah, because growing up, paper was expensive, right? When I was little, we didn't often have school supplies, or if you did, what could you do with them, right? And I see paper as an opportunity to create, and I enjoy creating, but also a fresh new piece of paper is an opportunity to change, right? To make something new and different. And I think we always have the opportunity to do something new and different. I write about that my experience to education was not a straight line, and I do believe, kind of like critical thinking is recursive, so too is life. But like we were saying earlier, when you have that danger of that single story, and if things don't happen chronologically or the way that you think they're supposed to happen, people then self select themselves out of achieving their dreams, or doing what they want to do, or being what they want to become, because they think, oh, I did this, I'm not worthy or deserving, or I didn't do this the right way. And in some ways, a clean sheet of paper is in some sense is the reality, I think, of who we are, because as long as you're alive, that sheet of paper is clean, right?
Mm.
It's another opportunity to do something new and different. And as an educator, I believe that. And I imagine, it took me, flunking out of school, I would say fabulously. F's are for fabulous. Semester, I got like five fabulous things. And it took me like 5 years of stopping and starting and not understanding what was going on. And I didn't realize then that the universe was training me to be a teacher. And it's something I would have never chosen, I'm sure, kind of like in some epic tale. Not that I'm some epic hero, like, the hero's journey has to go through this in order to transform, because I would have never chosen on my own, because I'm hard headed. And I think in some ways, I kept, if we want to use the metaphor of a sheet of paper, right? I kept thinking that that paper was dirty, or I've already messed it up, or I couldn't do anything, or God forbid, I've run out of paper and I don't have any more. I can't afford anymore. So to me, the fresh sheet of paper, the empty place, is that hope that we all have, because in some sense, right, this physical blank sheet of paper is a physical manifestation, but it's also, I think, an intellectual and spiritual representation of what we all have inside of us. At any moment, we can decide that that's where we are at, and we can start again. And more importantly, all those other sheets of paper that you think you messed up, that you crumbled up, that you threw away, or that you set on fire because you don't want anybody else to see, right? You have to trust that all of that prepared you for what you were going to write next, and not to be ashamed of that, to embrace that, and then to use that to tell your story. Because I think that makes your story more powerful. It makes your story more human. So, yeah, nothing excites me um, like paper. And I love it. And I give my kids paper, although they're kind of privileged. They kind of think, mama is. I just say I'm sparkly, right? I'm extra. But I especially love those sketch notebooks that don't have the lines and you can just write through them. I had a teacher, a writing teacher, who introduced that to me my first year of graduate school, and it was like a game changer. And I'm sure everybody else probably thought it was no big deal, but for me, it was like Scooby Doo, like, "Rrr," like, "Rrr." And he showed us the book, and he put everything in the book. So like when he was balancing his budget, when he's, talking to his partner, when he's sketching a poem, everything went into that sketchbook, right? And that was deep. I was like, wow, that means that you're like physically on a sheet of in a text or on a sheet of paper, giving yourself permission to say that there's nothing separating you from your writing. So if I'm figuring out how I'm going to balance and pay my bills for the month, I can put that on one page. The next page I might have notes from the doctor. The other page I might have notes from my literature class, but the next page might be the first three lines of a new poem I'm going to write. It's like you're acknowledging that it's all what connected, that
Mm.
it's all together. And that to me was like super duper powerful, but also in the sense it's a physical kind of manifestation or attitude that starts with a physical shift, then I think affects how you think, and then it affects how you create it. And from that moment on, yeah, it only solidified this notion of thinking about paper in that way. So yeah, I know that was kind of long winded, but that's what your great question makes me think about.
Oh, I love that. And you also write that after a little passage about citing Stephen King's On Writing, which is such a brilliant book. But
Isn't that? Oh my God, I love it.
he's talk about an act of service. That book. A lot of people cite that
Yes.
book over and over again because it just
Hmm.
really speaks to the I don't know the I hesitate to use the word plight of the writer, but it really speaks to just the nuts and bolts of just there's really no substitute. They're reading a lot, writing a lot, and sitting with it and
Right.
getting through it and then
And the stuff we let get in the way, right? And he says, throw all that crap away, right?
exactly. Yeah, and and you even write, turn off those negative self voices, those negative people and negative situations, and do the positive you, which is believing in yourself and in your writing through direct action, reading, writing, and loving yourself, challenges and all. So that's I don't know, just I'd love to hear you just speak to that because I know for someone like me, I have incredible negative self talk. I might be my own worst enemy. Actually, I am my own worst enemy in so many ways because of that, because of those voices in my own head. But you speak to it really brilliantly here.
Well, thank you. And I hope I just need to validate you, just the fact that you and I are in this virtual space together having this wonderful conversation. I'm glad you didn't turn those voices off. I think, I would have to say, writing is something that I struggled with my entire life, because the first time I took comp, like I got a fabulous, fabulous, right?
Hmm.
And I didn't think that I could write. And I was always looking for external validation. And I think it was much harder too, because also too, and again, I wasn't reading people who look like me, right? There was so much I didn't know, but also too, want to hold space. I don't think you can separate those negative self voices from what's happening to you internally in terms of your family, right? There might be generational things going on. You might be experiencing oppression, right? That so much of that carries with us from who we are, how we were raised, how we were loved, what we experience. And I'm not saying, I'm blaming folks, but I'm saying it's the reality of what we're doing. So by the time you go to speak, those negative self voices could be like a culmination of so many things that have happened to you. And I always joke about Frederick Douglass, and and I'm not saying that slavery is funny, but humor is my way. You have to laugh in order not to cry. I think of in his narrative when he's learning how to read, and at least, and please correct me if I'm wrong, I'm not a historian, although, I like it peripherally and I call myself a bootleg historian. Descendants of African slaves in the United States of America were only so far, only the only group of people in the United States for whom it was illegal to read and write.
Mm.
And I can remember in the narrative, there's a moment that when Frederick Douglass learns how to read and write, he says very clearly, I didn't fully understand what it meant to be a slave or to be enslaved, right? I'm paraphrasing, but that's what he says.
Yeah.
And that's deep. So, I mean, let's just peep that for a moment. He was a slave, right? He saw people be whipped and murdered. And he picked cotton. He did all those horrible things. So he didn't even understand slavery himself, but he was a slave. But then once he became literate, he understood. And that's profound. So then if you make that link, then imagine how powerful it is then to say, not only am I going to read and write, but I'm going to have the audacity to what? Write my own stuff.
Hmm.
I would argue it's the most ultimate power that any human being has is to create and to talk about or create work that then talks about their existence. And I would argue we live in a society that doesn't necessarily what? Perpetuate that. Because if I
Yeah.
can't control what you're thinking or what you write, that might be what? Dangerous. So I would argue that any person, no matter what your identity, if you decide that you are going to what? Create and write, and you do that through writing, that is an extremely powerful gift and thing to have. And I would argue in most of our experiences, and most of our experiences as individuals in this society, that is something I would argue is not readily cultivated, that it is associated with privilege. And I don't know if I would have thought that, over two decades ago. But after 25 years of teaching, I realized even my own privilege, this notion of literacy, and then jumping from literacy then to the ability to create your own text, to speak yourself and your identity, and then to define your experience. Woo, we talking about some powerful stuff. So I think that has always been the tension that human beings have pushed upon in when we live in a societies of power. Does that make sense?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, and there's a moment in your book where you're having just a argument with one of your instructors. You were using like some, yeah, like you were using like some as you write, like black vernacular for one of your characters, and they were really pushing back. Well, essentially saying, well, be that as it may, you won't get published. And it's like, well, to your point of this writing and controlling of existence and taking up the space that is rightfully yours, if you are censoring language to appease a certain gatekeeper, then you are effectively erasing a certain voice and a certain persona. And I think you're really kind of speaking to that in here, and it's just like, yeah, you are every bit in the right to push back against that, because who wants this inert voice on the page when there are so many other voices out there that can be represented in print in a certain vernacular. As Mitchell S. Jackson writes sometimes, he's like, I use high low diction. Sometimes he goes high and other times he goes low, and that juxtaposition is so brilliant.
Yeah, and I thought that I had proven, right? Like, I did my bachelor's degree in English. I did a master's in English before I started my MFA. I was like, okay, I got my street cred, right? Like, I can pontificate, but I'm not interested in doing that, right? Like, I did that in a kind of naive way to say, okay, I shouldn't have to prove to you that I know how to do it, right? Like,
Yeah.
so if I'm writing this way, it's because it's artistic. And now here we come full circle back to Zora Neale Hurston. You ask great questions, right? So when you read Their Eyes Are Watching God, in prose, it is standard English, right? But in dialect, she uses what? The When the people are talking to each other, right? When they're speaking, when the characters are speaking in dialogue, she uses dialect. So Zora Neale Hurston, just by the structure of that novel, she's saying, yeah, I can use your language, right? I can use standard English, right? But I'm doing so because what I can. And when the characters speak, they're going to speak dialect. They're going to speak a language that's indigenous, that's unique to who they are. And what a powerful play to show the level of skill she has. But also, she's thumbing her nose at standard English, right? And of course, that book was panned by reviewers. But she has had the last laugh, because I would argue that Their Eyes Are Watching God by Hurston is one of the most heavily what canonized text, right? Not only in academia across the United States, but I would say across the world. But she shows the tension with that. And I would say then I didn't, I knew that I had to defend myself. It would be only later that I understood how violent that was, because that was one microaggression upon many that happened over and over again. And the thing I would argue that's so sad about it is that the instructor is what, defending a certain standard, is gatekeeping or policing, right, this industry that requires that if you enter into the arena, you must write and present yourself a certain way, not understanding that when you do that, you are violently what, keeping other people out. And it's a form of gatekeeping. And then ask yourself, if you think about on a very micro individual level, what are the stories that get restricted or will never get told because they don't, so to speak, go through the laundering process of that strict gatekeeping. And that's where I was, in the start of the 21st century, not fully understanding what happened, but trying to write my way out of what Melissa Harris Perry calls the cricket room, right? And that's why I love her theory so much. And my hope as an instructor is that I never recreate that for my students, because I want to be clear, it was very violent. But if you ask me if I think that the instructor was intentionally malicious, no, I don't think they were intentionally malicious. I think they were doing what they thought was best, but it still makes it what? No less violent. And maybe describing that on a very micro level, my hope is then the utility that that might have is that we can all look at ourselves, no matter who we are, and hope that we're not doing the same thing when we interact with others, or when we interact with our students, or if we're gatekeepers of some kind that make decisions that determine who gets in and who gets out. I think the thing that humbled me as I went on to teach, I found out that that experience was very common to students and to writers, particularly writers of color, or writers whose first language was not English,
Mm.
right? So yeah, yeah. Talk about being true as a storyteller, telling the story, maybe being okay that you don't understand it all, but then maybe sitting back and seeing how it contributes what to this larger discussion that's happening. And I think a big discussion around white supremacy and language is really important that's happening now. I'm just excited that people are looking at it. But then I was just, my feelings was hurt, and I didn't write for a long time because of that, a very long time.
Yeah. Well, you talk about your very nonlinear path through education, higher education, and you wrote late in the book, and you've already alluded to it here. That I dropped out of college. It would take 5 years before I would develop the courage and opportunity to return, let alone retake first year writing, and that in and of itself would, I think, stop a lot of people. They drop the baton and not pick it up again, and just go about surviving and just go about life. What was, how did you push through that and not get so discouraged that you stopped altogether?
That's a good question, and that's a big gap that you notice in the book that I haven't. I don't know if I'm ready to write about it, but I will honor your question. I met a lot of people who had been well, I shouldn't say former. They were former activists, right, in the 60s and 70s, probably some of the smartest people I'd ever met in my entire life. None of them were formally educated, but all of them were serving their communities, doing very courageous things, really helping to make life better for other people. But I saw how they were marginalized and they were excluded from other benefits in society because they didn't have that piece of paper. And I want to be clear, right? Education comes in many forms.
Hmm.
I'm a product of TRIO, very proud product of TRIO. I'm a Ronald McNair Scholar. And my TRIO advisor at Iowa State, who's no longer with us, may he rest in peace and power, Dr. George Jackson, he used to say, school is where you get the piece of paper, life is where you get an education, right?
Mm-hmm.
So I want to say, from my perspective, from where I was standing then, right? Because I want to own that. To me, that piece of paper was the only way for me as a Black woman from the South Side of Chicago that I could ever find somewhat sense of justice or access for me. It was almost like it was a club that you couldn't get into. And seeing all these people who I had great respect for, who I admired, who educated me, who took care of me, and seeing how they were totally excluded, I could see that being me in 10 or 20 years. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah.
And that's what I said, let me go back and get my education. Also kept getting fired from jobs, right? I would say stuff like, oh, I see myself being manager in the next couple of years, and then boom, fired, right? Rinse and repeat. And just being taken advantage of. And so it's kind of a double-edged sword, because in some ways, yes, I did go back, I did finish my education, but it didn't prevent me from experiencing discrimination, right?
Yeah.
And so I still haven't worked to unpack those, because those are still much harder stories to tell. And I always too try to, keep a fine line of whose story to tell. Am I telling my story? Am I telling somebody else's story, right? Subject position. But, having dropped out of school and did a lot of wonderful and creative things for which I'm very humbled and grateful for, meeting a lot of people who I just looked at every day and I was like, wow, you're brilliant. You're amazing. Why aren't you in school? Oh, because of this, because of that. And I would say all the ways in which society blocks people from continuing their education, right? People with felonies, people with extreme debt, or your student loan goes into repayment, and then you default, right? All the ways in which structures set you up, and which we know now, right? The majority of students, if they do drop out, they don't come back, not because they're not smart or capable, not because they don't. Have the ability. It's because some structural thing has prevented them to have that access because of how the system is set up. And I met a lot of people like that, and I didn't want to be me. So in some ways, I literally was running and fighting for my life. That's how I felt. And if you look at the data and statistics around African American women and how we are educated, how we represent, a large number of us have advanced degrees, I would argue, and I'm not going to speak for myself, but in my interpretation, because we're trying to outrun that damaging oppression of that intersection with race and gender. And so, I would have to say to you, I was afraid. I didn't want to end up like that.
Mm.
But of course, God protects babies and fools. I got through and went through, but also then I was exposed to a different kind, right, of racism that wears on you like a drop of water, right, dripping on your head, constantly, that you can't seem to get rid of.
Mm.
And that's something that I'm working on now in my second collection of essays, if I can finish them. Yeah, you really asked a good question.
Oh,
Yeah.
well, thanks. Well, and kind of like speaking of water, it made me kind of think back to a very early and very symbolic passage that you wrote in the introduction about a friend of yours throwing you in the deep end of the pool and you couldn't swim, and
Yeah.
you're frantically thrashing in the water, try to get to the shallow and get to the edge of the pool. And to me, that strikes me as very symbolic of those sort of systemic structures that are kind of in place to make sure that that certain people can't swim and symbolically swim, and and you were kind of alluding to it just a moment ago, those structures that are in place to make sure that not everyone has an equal shot. And
Yeah, and how dare you try to get to the edge of the pool? I mean,
yeah,
we could talk about structurally, right? The data around poor people and people of color, particularly African Americans, and swimming pools and segregation, but then the de facto segregation that continues, right, as a result of the disparities. But going back to that image, that scene that you talked about, when I'm in the room with the teacher and they say that about my writing, that was her throwing me right into the pool.
yeah,
And here I am trying to survive and get to the edge of the pool. I think the sad thing, and I'm writing about this now, I was supposed to drown. I should have self-selected. I should have let myself sink to the bottom of the pool
mm,
and die. How dare you claw back and get to the edge of the pool and pull yourself out of the pool and live and survive?
yeah,
And I think we have a lot of people and identities who have that experience in everyday life, because the way sometimes structures and society is set up, and maybe this is what I try to get at in what's understood don't mean to be explained, right? When I talk about the murder of George Floyd, is that certain people are meant to accept their death, right? This is your path. You need to accept it. Because in order for society to run smoothly, certain bodies and people and experiences are expendable. We just want to concern ourselves with the dominant narratives and stories, not anything different. And that to me is much more profound. And I think it's easier to desensitize ourselves to that experience when we see it kind of in a big way. I think what storytelling does, right, when individuals start to tell their story, right, because if we use drowning as a metaphor, right, or learning how to swim as a metaphor, think of how many people have those experiences. And I think when storytellers then tell the experience, it allows us what to see it, right? As Kimberly Crenshaw from Intersectionality would say, it gives us a frame. So then once we have a frame, we can see it. And then my hope is we can stop what? Throwing people into the pool, or at least giving them opportunities and classes to teach them how to swim, so that when they are thrown in the pool or when they do fall in, or God forbid, let them choose to be in the pool and have leisure,
Yeah.
they can survive, and live. And I think that is the power, if I could get back to your beautiful theme, of when we tell stories and when we have multitude of stories and different ways of telling stories, so that we can what better see.
Yeah, and also embedded in the pool metaphor is, if you're wasting your time thrashing for the side of the pool, like all
Yeah,
that energy could be better spent towards a more enriching life, an enriching narrative. But instead, it's just like, just to stay afloat is its own burden, and like that should be table stakes. The swimming should be table stakes, flotation should be, and buoyancy should be table stakes, so that you can actively contribute in the way that you're meant to. And then if you're always thrashing, you're left with very little to contribute, and that's another way of drowning and silencing voices.
exactly. And think how many people, and again, I don't want to be insensitive, because literally, right, there are people who drown in order what to escape to freedom or to come to this country, right? I want to hold and honor respect for that.
Yeah.
But there's this thing that it also touches me, because it's the tenacity of how powerful the human spirit is. That there are some of us, and you say, you know what, I'm going to go for it anyway. I'm going to try, right? And maybe if we recognize that, then we what can build those infrastructures, or we can reach out and help, so that people don't have to do that. Because I think at the end of the day, people are still going to what go for it. People are still going to try in order to get what they need and to succeed. And at least that's what I was taught. I remember my mother, we didn't have a lot, or we didn't have this, or we would have holes in our shoes. And my mother was like, well, what can you do about it? And I was like, nothing. She said, well, we can't worry about it. But do I go? Yes, still go. Right. And still show up. So we were in there, looking extra, but we were still there, right? Embarrassed and all, but still go. And yeah, you're right. And that was that thrashing, right? I don't have everything I need, but I'm still gonna show up. And my thing is that you don't want people to have that experience. We have to continue to improve society, so that you're right, people aren't thrashing. I know people used to ask me, do you know how to swim? And I would say I know how to survive.
Mm.
and that's not normal. It's not healthy, right? Everybody shouldn't be put in a position where they're just surviving.
Yeah, to some of the harder things you write about, there's this moment towards the end of, let's see it, the name of the essay, disparate impacts, and I believe you're talking about flirting with going to the South for grad school, and you're seeing Confederate flags everywhere, and you're like, wow, this is messed up. That it's just this transparently racist in a lot of areas. But as you go up north, you just find that those flags are more coded or more hidden, and that's even more insidious. And you write about it perfectly. That it's just there are Confederate flags everywhere, even in places we can't see them. And I had circled that, and I was just like, damn, like it just like kicked me in the gut. It's just that notion, that realization you come to.
Yeah, and there's in a way, it's drawing the parallel to Frederick Douglass, right? He was enslaved, but didn't understand slavery until could read and write himself. There is a way, because we think blackness is a monolith, right? No, blackness is different. It does To be black in Chicago is not the same to be black in Mississippi,
Right.
and I'm sure even within Mississippi, to be black somewhere else in the state is different than the other, right? Like, and there's a way that I assumed, and I think of my generation, right? That if you just got that piece of paper and you just got that education, right? And I write this, my mom said, education is something that they will never take away from you. I thought by getting that piece of paper, it would solve, you wouldn't be subject to racism, right? And I know that's naive to say, But that's what I thought. Let me just prove that I'm good enough. Let me get this, and it would all go away.
Mm.
And there's a way in that essay you see my ignorance, right? And I want to hold space. I'm still very ignorant, but I'm having to learn what racism is, although race has shaped every single thing in my life, right? It has shaped everything from my parents, my grandparents, but still didn't understand it myself. And that's profound, right? Of how much we normalize, and I want to hold space and I hope we can follow a thread through our metaphor, how much we have normalized and made acceptable for people to what drown and die, so that when they drown, we can say, oh, it was an accident. Oh, they didn't swim hard enough, or they didn't know, as opposed to revealing the structure. And I think we as people are in dehumanizing and oppressive situations that we ourselves don't understand. But the irony is, at the same time, what? It's taking us out and it's metaphorically or literally killing us, right? So it is like, is it Lucrece in the Cask of Amontillado, right? Who's with the Montresor the whole time, right? Thinking that the Montresor is his what? Friend? And the whole time he's leading him to the catacombs, even when he's what? Cementing him up in blocks. He hasn't yet realized. And I think so many of us who are generationally oppressed or have oppressed identities are in that experience. So you're absolutely right. Here I was, a black girl from Chicago, 2 generations removed from Mississippi, going to Minnesota and not even understanding what real racism was or is. But I also want to hold space, again, not excusing it. When we look right, I think starting 2015, when you started to get national attention to these disparities,
Mm.
which are higher in states above the Mason-Dixon line than lower. I would say even as a nation, right, we weren't fully either understanding or recognizing the depth of how intense and complex structural racism is, and then the impact that it has on people's daily lives. And what an irony, right? This is why we study literature, right? People will dig us up 1,000 years from now and say, what in the hell were these people doing? Actually doing these things, but not even understanding it. And I think that was a moment for me. I think it made experiences more painful because I didn't understand what racism is. But the bad part about it is that the people who were perpetuating it also, I think, didn't understand it either, which doesn't excuse them. But I think, man, we're in something serious now, and we got to figure out how to deal with it. And it can't be impaling each other or pointing the fingers. It has to be some other way, because you don't want to look up and there's no one standing. There has to be a way to figure out this tragic mess um, that we now have found ourselves in, and we're not going to escape it by ignoring it and saying that it doesn't exist. And I want to say, in one facet, right, if we can say a pie could be a symbol for a solution, I would argue a sliver or a piece of that pie has to be having space for people to tell their stories. Because if they don't, we will never understand what it means. All we have is these words, but we have no clue, right, of what it means or how it is impacting people based upon their identities and how they walk through their lives.
Mm. Yeah, it's beautifully put. And yeah, and when you're setting down to, you have some ideas that you might have, written down in a journal or your a sketch pad, and you're looking to metabolize these and synthesize them into an essay. What do you like to have in place for you as you sit down to write and confront that great energy of the blank page?
I like humor. I think I have a secret desire to be a stand-up comedian. It just never worked out. I love to laugh. I love music. Because standard English is not my first language, and I started playing flute, I think, when I was in fourth or fifth grade, and music saved my life. I went on to be a band nerd. I was in a marching band. I was in orchestra. It really saved me. So I hear essays and words as music.
Mm.
It's like a song. So I want there to be rhythm. And then sometimes I'm upset. Maybe I'm angry. Maybe there's something I want to unpack and talk about. And then I feel like I have to earn the essay, right? I think of, is it Hugo's triggering town, right? So once I figure out what the trigger is, right? Then I have to put myself aside to know that, well, what more could it be about? And hopefully then I don't get in the way. Because maybe, for example, I'm thinking writing about George Floyd, may he rest in peace. might have been the trigger, but in maybe trying to tell the story about George Floyd, I end up telling other stories, right? Particularly about what it means to be a Black woman in academia, right?
Yeah.
So I think that's what I think about. And also saying what it's okay. Like I tell my students, you don't have to have the answers, right? And you know that, right? Good writing is not always about having the answers, right? It's like a short story. What they call it, denouncement. Like it ends, right? The action stops, but it doesn't mean that we know, right, what's going to happen or is there a resolution. I think essay writing is the same way. Sometimes it's beautiful enough just to someone to set the scene, to express something that happened and to express those emotions, and that's enough. And so for me, I feel like I just have to earn it. And I feel like when that happens, I feel like it's a piece of music, that you're playing that comes to a end, not the end, a end.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and so, yeah, those are the things I think about. But as a poet, right, I really had to humble myself because it wasn't until I wrote that essay for A Good Time for the Truth with the encouragement from Sun Young. I don't think I saw myself as an essayist. It's only something that I discovered in order to make sense of something. So once SY showed me that, oh, Ty, you can write this essay about what happened to you. And not only can it be about this minor experience, but then you can pull out and bring in history and structural things, right? So you find the universal in the personal, right?
Yeah.
I now know that I can use an essay maybe to unpack something that even myself I can't understand and maybe other people can't understand. And I want to say that I have intentionally written about things that have impacted my life in negative ways, but also I feel like that negative experience by telling it might encourage other people to understand it and it might help other people not to be alone. I'm very interested in politics and gender and race and motherhood, but also, it can be subject to change. And I also feel like the writer is where I get to be me unapologetically. And I just have to learn that it's okay to be who I am. And I say this to myself and I say this to any writers that are listening, that the way you see the world and the way you experience the world is the way it should be because it's that gift for you in order then to express it. And maybe what we see and experience is because it represents that's the work we're supposed to do. And I spent a lot of time beating myself up for that and maybe feeling guilty. Oh, Ty, you're too negative. Oh, you shouldn't talk about this. Oh, you shouldn't talk about that.
Mm.
As opposed to one day I said, oh, maybe I see it because what? It's my work. So as writers, you see something, you're obsessed with something. As creators, that thing is significant to you. Honor that, step to it, and then be true to that because then you have to trust what? That's your work and that's what you have to do. So if you say to me why I write to survive. I write not to be angry. I write not to make sense of the world, but more importantly, in addition to creating, I write to say that no, what you experience and you see and what you feel is true. Because so much, I think, I talked about violence is when you don't hear your own voice, but also another violence happens when people gaslight you and they say what you're experiencing is not what you've experienced.
Mm.
And I try to write in a way that says, no, not only did I experience this, but let me show you evidence of that.
Mm.
And that's why I write. At least today, if you meet me tomorrow and I say something different, please don't lose respect for me.
Oh, that's great. Well, Taiyon, this was such a wonderful conversation. I'm so glad you got to really unpack some of the themes in this wonderful collection that you've written. And I'm just so glad that we got to meet over the phones here and talk a little shop. So I just want to say, thank you so much for the work and thanks for coming on to talk shop. This was wonderful.
Well, thank you too. And I wouldn't be a teacher if I didn't circle back. So turn off that negative self voice and just continue to do your work. I'm so very honored to meet you and to be in conversation with you. And I just want to say thank you and to everyone for reading and supporting my work. It is a dream come true. Very honored and very humbled. So peace and blessings. Thank you.
Oh, yes. Thanks to Taiyon. Yes. Awesome. Made me feel good about myself for a second there. And thanks to you for listening, CNFers. Not too long ago, I ate a second helping of oatmeal. And by not too long ago, I mean like a half an hour ago. and with my usual protein powder and peanut butter, and I wonder why I can't get leaner from my health and all, and the vanity that I think we all suffer from. I know I do to some extent. Like, I know I need to focus primarily on protein and veggies, and fat loss happens in the kitchen. You can't outrun a bad diet, as they say. But I can't shake my desperate craving for the salty goodness of crunchy peanut butter, and then tomorrow in my journal, I'm going to beat the shit out of myself again. Yeah, my issues with my body and food are legion. It's messed up. I wish I didn't feel this way, but after so many years of being conditioned about aesthetics and appearances, being made fun of by my friends, calling me fat all my life, it really messes with you. All the women are like, "Welcome to the club, asshole." But it's true. It's just shit I have dealt with my whole life. So I got my copy edits back for The Front Runner. Spoke with my editor. I think he's as sick of the book as I am. I think he's as sick of me as I am, too. I was scared to open up the latest file of the book. I was expecting carnage, a bloodbath, and that signature voice of frustration you can feel vibrating off the page from a copy editor who is, on the whole, a prickly brand of person. I know when I do proofreading and copy editing, I just sometimes can't contain my frustration for some of the repeat offenses that you see in a text. I'm working on that, okay? But I was surprised by the lack of issues raised by the copy editor up to this point. I requested to connect with her on LinkedIn. She has not replied. It's mainly a boatload of comma shit, and a few issues of where she couldn't confirm a person's name. But thanks to my omnibus spreadsheet, I could find the article that had a person or the person in question, and in the little comment bubble, I was able to say, well, here's how it is. I can confirm for you that it is spelt this way, and here's the link to the story if you care to look it up into a Dropbox folder. I'm a couple chapters into part 3, which means I'm almost through since I began this task on Tuesday, November 12th. Cruising along. The final third of the book could be a total shit show, but I won't know, and neither will you until later. The last phase is getting the last round of photo permissions secured by this one guy who is, by all accounts, sweet, but he's just a giant pain in the ass. He is dragging his feet so slowly. I've offered to drive down to California with my scanner and just get this shit done. It's maddening. I'm like, I'll meet you at a Starbucks. I'll be out of your life in 30 minutes. But he has some incredible photos, and I really want them for the book. But I only have maybe 10 more days before things have to largely be buttoned up for good. So deadlines make for good taskmasters, and maybe if I can impress upon him the deadline, it might happen. I'll message him again soon and say, dude, we got like 5 days. All right. So there's this older personal trainer coach I like to listen to. His name's Dan John. I've shared his work, his Easy Strength books. I like his philosophy to strength training, especially as I crest into middle age and have become so depressingly brittle. It's just like everything. Sometimes I'll just pick up the goddamn cast iron skillet and like my wrist will just pinch and it's fucked for 5 days. It's like I strained something in like a ligament in my wrist for just picking up a 8-pound cast iron skillet. Like, what the fuck is up with that? And then it'll just be easily triggered by if I don't brace myself or pick something up correctly, and suddenly like my back will just like tweak out, and I get it's very depressing for someone who's been somewhat athletic his whole life. A big thing this guy says is the body is one piece, meaning let's say you have a bum shoulder like I do right now. It's okay to say military press 40 pounds with my left arm, my good arm, and maybe just 10 to 15 with my right, as long as it's not hurting. It's something. It's not, I'm not doing nothing. It's better doing something than nothing. And here's the one part. Just because I'm taxing one side more than the other doesn't mean that everything is localized. Like hormones, blood, and other shit are pulsing through the entire body. Healing agents, they're not detouring the bad area. So there's a cascade effect that even if I do some big body movements and tack on some smaller stuff, if I'm squatting, all that hormonal shit that's released from the big move, it's following my blood vessels to my arms and shoulders and back and brain. So the body is one part. I like that. Likewise, and here's the crux of it. There's your context. Here's the crux. Our writing life is one piece. Work, grocery shopping, sleeping, exercise, fucking, eating, reading, attending readings, telling your friends about a cool book or a podcast, watching movies, staring into nothing. Just because you're not maxing out writing words in a manuscript doesn't mean you're atrophying. Sometimes you need to step away from the writing. Hustle culture will tell you that you must grind out every day, grind out writing. Yeah, I'll sleep when I'm dead. That whole fucking mindset. There might be some time for that where you really do have to grind out a bunch of words, but it's best to surrender to a seasonal approach to your work. It's all one piece. So if you're feasting over here, it doesn't mean you're starving over there. It's all circulating through the same body. I don't know why I felt a need to say this, but it felt right. It's easy to shame ourselves into thinking we're not writing enough or publishing enough or reading enough. Social media and capitalism have driven us to the brink of our collective and individual sanities. It's okay to consider the day a win for merely getting out of bed, getting your kids to school, or not dropping your phone in a puddle or a toilet. We're all tired, and none of us feel like we're doing enough, or successful enough, or rich enough, or thin enough, or young enough. I have no solutions except to remind myself, and you, that there's little point in putting any extra pressure on ourselves to achieve. The body is one piece. A writing body is one piece. Treat it well. Treat it with compassion, maybe. Above all else, you'll be okay. We'll be okay. I can only hope we will be okay. So stay wild, CNFers. And if you can't do interviews, see ya.